beginning to reinstate mask mandates. This as Biden has lost control of the pandemic, with the U.S. hitting nearly, well, just shy of 1 million deaths attributed to the China virus. Here's the GOP vowing to get power back to the hands of the people.
We are going to take power after this next election. And when we do, it's not going to be the days of Paul Ryan and Trey Gowdy and no real oversight and no real subpoenas. It's going to be the days of Jim Jordan and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Dr. Gosar and myself doing everything to get the answers to these questions.
Joining me now, the man himself, Florida Congressman on the House Judiciary Committee, Matt Gaetz. Congressman, Merry Christmas to you. Glad to have you back. You know, many Americans would be glad to hear that the House, under new GOP management, wouldn't return to the days of Paul Ryan, that model of attacking conservatives and coddling socialists. However, Mitch McConnell did just that recently. Not only did he allow the socialists to raise the debt ceiling, but he made sure they'd retain the ability to use reconciliation to harm Americans with what the CBO is calling a $5 trillion spending package, the Better Before Biden bankruptcy boondoggle there. If Democrats pass that thing and it devastates the economy the way economists say that it will, won't the GOP co-own the destruction courtesy of guys like Mitch McConnell?
Increasingly, we're seeing that there is a uniparty in Washington, D.C. It has members that call themselves both Republicans and Democrats, but they pave the way for this spending that fuels the special interests and fuels the lobby corps principally. And so you played a clip from a press conference where I laid out a different vision for Republican leadership in Congress, not a version of Republican control that has us coddling Democrats or working with them on trains and bridges and whatever they're calling infrastructure this week, but instead holds this regime accountable. Our health care committees should be conducting oversight on NIH and Dr. Fauci. Our Judiciary Committee should be conducting oversight over the Department of Justice when they want to put terrorism labels on parents. We should have our Education Committee looking at the corrupt Biden Center that existed at the University of Pennsylvania. In almost every committee, there is a legitimate investigation that needs to begin, but Republicans have to commit ourselves to actually engaging those investigations because you saw, Chris, you've been very critical. The last time Republicans had unified control of the government, we failed to meet the promises that we made to people regarding repealing Obamacare, and that's why we got thrown out and Nancy Pelosi got put back in power. We have to learn from that lesson, and I need backup in Congress to execute on that vision.
Yeah, Congressman, I'm right there with you. I remember Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. They thought their job was to attack President Trump rather than go after Democrats for what they had done to us in the Obama era. I want to show some video up there to the folks around the country, and I want you to see it too, Congressman. It's coming out of Germany. Here you see police walking around with sticks, making sure that their people are properly spaced. Now that right there is a Dr. Fauci, Joe Biden dream. An America full of sheep being tended by their socialist shepherds. But for most Americans, that is a nightmare. Would you agree, Congressman?
I would, and it is also telling that when we give government bureaucrats, particularly these unelected bureaucrats, control, they don't give it back so easily. And that's why we should be trusting our people like we do here in the state of Florida. I took note of your preamble where you talked about California returning to mask mandates. Perhaps the hardest hit Californian might be Gavin Newsom himself because he couldn't comply with those very mandates. But I want to live in a country where everyone has freedom and all of our citizens are valued and respected in their choice. And there's nothing patriotic about mandates that are destroying our economy, that are harming our supply chain, that are really impacting the inflation that we continue to see throughout really the American economic ecosystem. And so I think that Joe Biden has got some real headwinds in the midterms coming up. The question will be whether or not Republicans are worthy of retaking power by embracing a vision of oversight rather than just serving as a valet to the lobby corps.
Well, you know, I think you're right about the headwinds that Mr. Biden is going to be facing. However, he doesn't think so. Listen to some big talk from Mr. Biden. Watch.
Now we look at 2022. I want to tell my Republican friends, get ready, pal. You're going in for a problem. And we need to stay unified.
So, Congressman, what does Mr. Biden there know that the rest of us don't, or is it just another one of his lies and distortions?
Well, I think that's tough talk from a very addled man. What we see in the data is that the right direction, wrong track data splits are devastating for Joe Biden. In recent days, multiple polls showing that 2/3 of Americans believe that we are on the wrong track. And this is something that Democrats own entirely. They have control of the presidency, of the House and the Senate. And I don't think they have a single popular bill to run on. There was no bump for Joe Biden after the infrastructure bill. Nothing seems to suggest that the Build Back Broke bill will be a boost in the districts that they need to win to retain control. And so we've got to continue to pursue that economic message. We've got to show people how kitchen table economics are working against them under the Biden regime. And we have to expose the corruption that has facilitated all of this nonsense in the first place.
Well, you brought up California earlier, and they become, of course, they joined other socialist-run states to reimpose their indoor mask mandates. These mandates, Congressman, didn't work before. We actually have something, this little thing we call data, to show they didn't work. So why are they using the same failed strategy? What is really all of this about in these socialist-run governments?
All I can figure is that people in California don't go inside very often. The weather must be so nice, they're not really inside a whole lot because it seems like a terrible way to live under the draconian mandates that, like you said, aren't rooted in science or data. I guess what I'm wondering, Chris, is why did these people reject the recall of Gavin Newsom? They must love this. The Californians must be so mentally unhealthy as a consequence of these vaccine mandates and their failed socialist government that they've just totally surrendered to it. I don't think the rest of America should surrender. That's why I'm glad my state, Florida, is a shining example of how to respond to COVID, how to do it in a way that doesn't wreck our economy and that respects the liberty interests of our citizens that are endowed by God.
Well, we've got a lot of problems with these mandates that are being imposed all over the country. Democrats, for example, using these mandates to weaken our military readiness because of them. The Air Force recently discharging 27 people, highly trained people, over their vaccination status. More are expected to follow. Now, if one was writing a script, Congressman, to destroy America and our way of life, you know, it looks an awful lot like what we're seeing out there. Put these mandates on, you get rid of healthcare workers in the middle of a pandemic. Put these mandates on, you get rid of individuals who are defending the country in uniform. This is frightening.
This is one of the things I'm most concerned about. It's not just the recent batch of service members that the Air Force has discharged from the military. It's the scores of additional individuals who have left the military voluntarily as a consequence of not getting the vaccine mandate. I've called on studies on readiness to see how these mandates are impacting training, research and development. I sat next to somebody at church recently who was a highly trained pilot who was voluntarily having to leave the Air Force because they felt as though their natural infection immunity wasn't being validated. Look, if we had a serious strategy to combat COVID, natural infection immunity, how to test for it, how to recognize it, how to build it into smart data-driven policy choices would be at the forefront of our thinking. But because Big Pharma can't make money off natural infection immunity, because there's no lobbyist for natural infection immunity, somehow we cast it aside and disrespect the contribution it can make to the problem set that is before us.
Man, that is such a great point you just made about Big Pharma and the agenda there. Democrats are also pushing to impose vaccine requirements for air travel. I couldn't believe this when I read it. Fang's boy toy, Congressman Swalwell, leading his fellow socialists with a baseless prediction, quote, if the requirement is implemented, we can go from 60% of Americans vaccinated to 80%. I don't know where the hell he gets that from, but one problem here, Congressman Gaetz, my medical status is none of Swalwell's or his pals in the CCP's business or anybody else in government's business. True?
Yeah, and it's the arrogance of government. People like Eric Swalwell think that they own the skies. And you shouldn't be limited in your ability to travel just because you've made a personal healthcare choice that, frankly, may be more data-driven than the decisions that we see out of the CDC. I've got Thomas Massey on my podcast Firebrand tomorrow, and he walks through misinformation that the CDC is putting out and not correcting. So I tend to trust a lot of the data around natural immunity, which would cut directly against the type of policy choice that would impose an air travel mandate. That is ridiculous. You saw the trouble that created just when they tried to do the mandates for pilots and how that impacted people. It would have the airline industry back before Congress requesting another bailout, Chris, if we did this. And that's the last thing we want to do with taxpayer funds.
Well, let me give that podcast one more plug here because it's called Firebrand. And as you mentioned, Congressman Massey going to be joining you to expose a lot of CDC corruption. A few weeks ago, we noticed the CDC removed the data for breakthrough cases from their website. Congressman, on what scientific basis was this done, number one? And why can't Americans see the reduced efficacy of these vaccines as we get these variants? And are you prepared to introduce legislation to punish the Centers for Disease Control when they withhold critical information to the nation's health?
Well, the investigation has to come before the sentence, but that's exactly what I was pitching in the clip that you played previously. At the CDC, we've departed from science and we've embraced pseudoscience and politics, and increasingly the very scientists involved in CDC grants are coming up with the outcome first to facilitate their funding rather than actually doing the research that could inform smart decisions. So there's still a lot of swamp left to be drained at the CDC. We need the investigations, we need the accountability, and frankly, the NIH is probably a pretty good place to start.
Well, Congressman Matt Gaetz, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the time and the efforts up there. I mean, I was glad as hell to hear that we won't be returning to the days of Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, the surrender caucus up there on Capitol Hill. It's good to hear. Merry Christmas to you and your family, sir. We'll see you
Merry
soon.
Christmas. Thank you so much, Chris. Not if I can help it on returning to those days of Ryan. We can do better.